Hello again, this is Dr. Rusty Jones. This is Viral Shakespeare, my YouTube lecture series for my English 334 Shakespeare students at Murray State University and any other interested parties who might be checking out the channel on YouTube. So this is Henry V, Acts 3 and 4. So if you're one of my students, make sure you've read Acts 3 and 4 before you listen to this lecture. And watch out because we do have some discussion board promptings that are coming up Friday, and you're expected to answer those, and I'll give you more details via email. So for this lecture on Henry V, Acts 3 and 4, I am titling this series of lectures because we are going to talk about a little bit of French today. Conférences sans pantalon, or lectures without pants, because you just don't know. All right, starting off in Act 3, Scene 3. Remember, Henry and company have made their way to France. They are now assaulting their first walled town. This is Harfleur. And I want to introduce a little idea to you that I think will bring a little bit more meaning to Henry's speeches in Act 3, Scene 3. The concept is called shock and awe. Shock and awe. This was coined by the American military in the First Gulf War in the 1990s. And the idea there is you bring such overwhelming, terrifying military superiority right off the bat that your enemy basically is so shocked and so awed that they absolutely lose the will to fight and they give up immediately. So if you come in really hard, really impressively right off the bat, basically you don't have any more war because the enemy just basically is so shocked that they just give up. This is basically what Henry is trying to do. He begins, essentially, by, get rid of some of my other notes here, by addressing the governor of Harfleur. And he is setting up this whole shock and awe scenario, but he's doing the entire thing rhetorically. The reality of the situation is, of course, historically he didn't have as many soldiers as the French. They weren't as well armed. They were generally sick going into France. But in Shakespeare's play, where we just have a few men before the walled town, which is probably just some people up on the balcony of Harfleur, we have Henry using his rhetoric as a way to shock and awe the French of Harfleur into basically giving up. But this brings up a point that I want to raise in a little bit. So I'm right at the beginning of Act 3, Scene 3 here. Henry says, "How yet resolves the governor of the town? This is the latest parle we will admit. Therefore to our best mercy give yourselves, or like to men proud of destruction defy us to our worst. For as I am a soldier, a name that in my thoughts becomes me best, if I begin the battery, the fight, the war, once again, I will not leave the half-achieved Harfleur till in her ashes she lie buried. The gates of mercy shall be all shut up, and the fleshed soldier, rough and hard of heart, in liberty of bloody hand, shall range with conscience wide as hell." Not unlike what we saw with the traitors, Henry's basically gaslighting these people again, saying, look, you've got to give up to me. If you don't, I'm going to let my soldiers go. They will range as wide as hell. They will rip your town apart, and there won't be anything I can do to stop them from doing that. So if you deny me, if you deny the fact that I should be in charge of Harfleur, it's on you. My men are let loose, and it's on you. Again, smart military strategy, this kind of shock and awe, or dangerous gambit for him to play. Because the thing about shock and awe is, if you threaten something and your enemy says no or gives you the finger or whatever it is, you have to be prepared to actually do it. So Henry's just going to escalate what he's going to do. And the fact of the matter is, if the French of Harfleur say, forget you, we're not going to let you in the town, go ahead and continue your siege, keep fighting against us, then Henry has to actually do it. And what he's suggesting is remarkably immoral. He says, a little farther down, he's speaking of his soldiers at line 17, that do with his smirched complexion all fell feats and linked to waste and desolation. What is it to me, when you yourselves are cause? There's the gaslighting. If your pure maidens fall into the hand of hot and forcing violation, what reign can hold licentious wickedness? when down the hill he holds his fierce career. We may as bootless as pointless spend our vain command upon the enraged soldiers in their spoil as send precepts to the Leviathan. I won't be able to stop it. It will be absolutely impossible, he says. Whilst yet my soldiers are in my command, this is about line 28 or so, whilst yet the cool and temperate wind of grace overblows the filthy and contagious clouds of heady murder, spoil, and villainy, give up while I still have control of this. If not, he says, if you don't, why, in a moment, look to see the blind and bloody soldier with foul hand defile the locks of your shrill, shrieking daughters. If we were in class, I'd ask you what that means, but he's talking about rape. Your fathers taken by the silver beards and their most reverend heads dashed to the walls, killing old men. Your naked infants spitted upon pikes, putting your babies on long spears. Whiles the mad mothers with their howls confused do break the clouds, as did the wives of Jewry at Herod's blood-hunting slaughtermen. So now he's doing that Bible thing again, where he's comparing in an Old Testament style that I'm going to kill your infants, and the mothers will scream, like when King Herod sent the people out, I guess this is technically New Testament, sent the men out to destroy all the firstborn of Israel. It's amazing the kind of apocalyptic language he's using here. What say you, he says at about line 42, will you yield and this avoid, or guilty in defense? You guys will be guilty of defending your own town if you try to stop me, if you don't let me in, be thus destroyed. And the governor says, look, we're not ready for this siege, so here, we give up. Henry, to be fair, goes on and says to his uncle, Exeter, use mercy to them all. So it sounds like the whole thing was a great big bluff. And in the clip that I'm going to put on canvas for you from the Kenneth Branagh film, when Henry finishes this great threat and the governor of Harfleur says, well, look, we give up, Kenneth Branagh's Henry V goes, oh, thank goodness. He gives a big sigh and his eyes close, like he never really intended to do this. But again, that's all fine if you want Henry to look like a really nice guy. But the fact of the matter is, if the French had said, no, you got to do it. You got to do these things that are categorically against the rules of war. And yes, even in the Middle Ages, there were rules of war. There were things you did and things you didn't do. And Henry apparently is ready to do them, but he lucked out, and his rhetoric convinced the French basically to give up. Okay. Skipping ahead to Act 3, Scene 4, this is one I really want to spend a little bit of time on, so I'm going to keep an eye on my clock here. But basically now we move into the French court and we move into the private chambers of Princess Catherine of France and her, quote, old gentlewoman, Alice, or Elise. And this is where the French that I mentioned early on comes in, because as you look at this scene, you will say to yourselves, as my students, well, Dr. Jones, I don't speak French, so I had no idea what this scene was about, so I skipped it. Or I looked on, Spark Notes or something like that, and it explained it to me, and because I don't read French, I figured it was fine. But here's the situation. Some of Shakespeare's own audience would have spoken French and would have understood this scene, and that's great. Others, the groundlings standing at the foot of the stage, would not, by no means. And this is the great thing about this scene between Catherine and the old gentlewoman Elise. You don't have to speak French to understand what they're doing. Everything is built into the scene itself. And my French is absolutely terrible, so I am not going to even try to pronounce a lot of the words here. But even though we don't understand necessarily right off the bat what Princess Catherine is asking her lady-in-waiting for, it starts with Elise. Tu as été en Angleterre, et tu bien parler le roi. So in other words, you've been to England and you speak the language pretty well. And Alice, or Elise, I'll call her Alice, says, un peu, madame, I speak a little bit of English, my dear one. And she asks, Catherine asks of her in the next line, comment appelez-vous l'aimant in anglais? So she's asking for l'aimant, and all she has to do is indicate her hand. She indicates her hand. We know what she's talking about. How do you say in English l'aimant? And Catherine responds, l'aimant, il appelait de hand. Catherine responds with de hand. Et les doigts, and if you don't know what a doigt is, All she has to do is this. And you know what it is. Et les doigts? The fingers. And Alice thinks on it for a while and says, appelez des fingres. Oui, des fingres. Les mains de hand, les doigts de fingres. Then she asks about the nails, and she uses the French for that. Alice explains that it's nails. Catherine repeats it. She then asks, Catherine asks at the bottom of page 50 about line, about line 19 or so, how you say le bras. Le bras. The arm, madame, the arm, Alice says. Et le coude, d'elbow. D'elbow. So again, you don't even have to know French to understand what's going on in the scene, but the implications of what's going on in the scene, this is what I want to talk about with you for just a second. Because on the surface, if I were to ask you in class, what is Princess Catherine doing with her maidservant? She's learning English. Why is she doing that? Does she know already that Henry is going to win this war against the French? Is she preparing herself to be basically a spoil of war? In which case, what she's doing is pretty dark. Or is this a cute little romantic scene, as it is quite often played, where she's learning English for really no reason whatsoever? The French know that Henry is coming. They have said so in previous scenes. Presumably, Catherine also knows that he's coming. If she is, in fact, preparing herself by learning English, this is politically a very smart thing to do because she knows as a lady of royal blood, she is very likely to be offered up as a kind of prize to Henry. And this, in fact, happens. We have heard, or will hear, that she was offered to Henry as a sort of a bribe to go away early in the play, and he has rejected this. But if he does, in fact, win, as it looks absolutely sure that he will, or as the audience who knows the history, if they do know the history, already knows that Henry's going to win Agincourt and he's going to win the French throne, she is probably going to be his bride so that the two kingdoms can be melded together through marriage. So in that case, politically, it's a very smart thing for her to do, to learn English. Plus, she can negotiate with Henry in his original language, which is great. That gives her an advantage. But one of the other ways to think about it is the fact that she might be, in translating her body into English, she's acknowledging the fact that her body is perhaps the most important spoil of all. So I wanted to stop for a minute and remind you that in 1066, remember this play is 1599, in 1066, the French invaded under William the Conqueror. They were known as the Normans, and they brought with them the French language. So all of the Anglo-Saxon words, all the German-based words that English had been based on, became influenced by, if not completely translated into French. Here's a couple of examples right here of English to French. So the Anglo-Saxon word cow became the French word beef, sheep became the French word mutton, and swine became the French word pork. So these Anglo-Saxon items, these Anglo-Saxon terms, became translated. They shifted from English, Anglo-Saxon, the land of the Angles, Angle land, England. They became translated from English into French. And what Catherine is doing, to some extent, is translating herself from French into English by translating her body parts, either in anticipation of Henry's victory or as a political move. And she is wise to do so, but it's also a bit of an acknowledgement that her body is exactly what Henry is going to want. And as it turns out later in the play, it is exactly what he wants because he wants to marry her, he wants to bring the kingdoms together, and as he said, he wants to breed good soldiers with her. So it's no coincidence that she's translating her body out of the French and into the English. And one of the most interesting aspects of that, and I will post a lovely little link to the Kenneth Branagh version of this scene that I think you'll really enjoy, and you'll see how it's presented as a kind of romantic flight of fancy, but at the end its terms become absolutely stark and a little bit dangerous. But one of the more interesting parts happens on page 52, it's about line 48 or so, where Catherine is asking a couple of other things, a couple of other words about her body and about her costume, etc. Where Catherine wants to know, how do you say, she says, comment appelez-vous les pieds et la robe? She's asking, how do you say foot and how do you say gown, basically. Pieds et la robe. And Elise responds with "de foot, madame," in English, the foot, et le gown. So she says the foot and the gown. Now, if you're a French speaker, you know why this is funny and a little bit scandalous, because in French, foot, which English for that thing that you step on, foot in French is very close to the French word for the F word, for that little biological thing that we all do every now and again, foutre. And I hope that doesn't get me flagged on YouTube. It might. And gown is very close to the French word for well, the C word for a woman's reproductive organ. And Catherine is beside herself. And I am not going to read the French here, but it's very clear from what the actress does that I cannot say those things in English. She says, "You want me to say foot? I can't do that. Good ladies don't say foot, and they don't say gown. Oh my goodness, for heaven's sake, I'm not going to do that." And she's completely beside herself. Now, I think what's important about this is the fact that two rather innocuous things in French, the foot and the dress that she's wearing, the gown, suddenly become very sexualized words when they are put into English and then they're transmuted back and forth between English and French. And that's no coincidence again, because part of what makes Catherine, I think, embarking on this English lesson in the first place is the idea that her sexuality, her sexual nature, her reproductive possibility is something that Henry wants very much and something that has been fought over in these dynastic wars for centuries. So I think that that's really, really important. So again, rabbit and duck from the last lecture. Is this a cute little scene that's all romantic as she's prepping for Henry's arrival? Is this a really political, slightly dark, with sexual undertones scene about what it is to be a woman during wartime? I tend to think the latter, as you can guess. Okay, moving on. Act 3, Scene 5. We get some political jingoism, meaning some pro-English propaganda that I'm sure Shakespeare's audiences would have loved. The Constable of France can't believe that the English fight so well. This is about line 15 or so, where he asks where the English soldiers get the kind of mettle that they have shown on the battlefield. Is not their climate foggy, raw, and dull? I can't do a French accent on this. Is not their climate foggy, raw, and dull? On whom, as in despite, the sun looks pale, killing their fruit with frowns? Well, he's got the English climate right, that's for sure. So I'm sure Shakespeare's audience would have laughed at that too. Standing in the mud at the Globe Theatre, as they no doubt were. Can sodden water a drench for Surin jades? Their barley broth decoct their cold blood to such valiant heat? They don't even have wine, he says. They drink that horrible ale stuff. Again, rather propagandistic, I think, but I'm sure Shakespeare's audience would have eaten it up to have a Frenchman saying, "Wow, England's such a rotten place. It's so cold and wet and gross. How can they fight so well?" But one of the other things from this scene that I wanted to point out to you is another important idea here called miscegenation. Miscegenation, also known as racial mixing. For the French in this scene, constructed by Shakespeare, of course, this is a terrible, scary idea. The Dauphin, at about line 27, says, "By faith and honor, our madams," our French women, "mock at us and plainly say our metal," the French metal, "is bred out. And they will give their bodies to the lust of English youth, to new store France, with bastard warriors." And the Duke of Bretagne comes in and says, "They bid us," the French, "to the English dancing schools and teach La Voltas high and swift Corantos, saying our grace is only in our heels, and that we are most lofty runaways." Again, a lot of jingoism, a lot of patriotism, propaganda, if you will, there. But what's interesting about that is Shakespeare has the French terrified of this idea of mixing the English race and the French. But what's interesting, again, when we get to that last scene between Henry and Catherine, that's exactly what Henry wants. He wants to mix these two races together, the English and the French, and breed a new kind of English-French hybrid warrior that's able to kind of take over the world. That is often cut in productions because it makes Henry kind of creepy, by our view, and a little bit scary. To want racial mixing, but to want it for very sort of self-interested and militaristic reasons. So we'll get there. We'll get to that point. Skipping forward. How am I doing here? Got 10 minutes left. Skipping forward. All right. Just wanted to remind you in Act 3, there we go. Sorry, my screen went blank. Just wanted to remind you in Act 3, Scene 6, page 56, we hear that Henry's friend, Bardolph, has stolen a pax. He has stolen from a church, and hanged must he be. And a little farther on, page 58, Act 3, Scene 6, about line 97 or so, Fluellen, the Welsh soldier, says to Henry, "Marry, for my part, I think the Duke hath lost never a man, but one that is like to be executed for robbing a church, one Bardolph. If your majesty know the man," which of course he does. And Henry says, "We would have all such offenders so cut off. And we give express charge that in our marches through the country there be nothing compelled from the villages, nothing taken but paid for, none of the French upbraided or abused in disdainful language, for when lenity and cruelty play for a kingdom, the gentler gamester is the soonest winner." So what he basically says there, and he's right about this, is the fact that we, as we march through France, are going to use everybody gently so that when we win, nobody can say that we're terrible, mean tyrants. It already takes the idea that they're going to win as a kind of given. But what's really spooky about this is the fact that Bardolph has been his great friend, Henry's great friend. We've seen Bardolph through Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and here Henry rather cavalierly says, "Well, he stole from a church. I told my men not to do that. Therefore, off you go." Hung by the neck. Again, he's able to throw his friends off with almost no concerns at all. Again, rabbit and duck. Shouldn't he do that? Well, politically he should, because you steal from a French church. You don't want your men viewed as tyrants or as I don't know, vainglorious pillagers of your country. So yeah, you have them hung if they do something illegal like that or if they disobey you. But this is your best friend, and it doesn't make us like Henry. So again, rabbit or duck, which one is he? Skipping forward. Act 3, Scene 7. I'm going to skip over this one too because it is particularly racially insensitive if you want to view the French as a race, which Shakespeare certainly did during his time period. And here, basically, the English audiences get a good laugh as the Dauphin and the Constable have a discussion right before they go to war about their horses. And there's a particularly ugly little line here on page 62, about line 42 or so, where the Dauphin says, "Then did they imitate that which I composed to my courser, for my horse is my mistress." He's writing sonnets to his horse because he considers his horse just like his mistress. He's a horse lover, and I'm sure the English audiences would have roared about that. But from our standpoint, making your opponents look not only weak and foolish, but also immoral, again, not unheard of in movies, TV shows, etc. these days, but there it is in Shakespeare's Henry V. Shakespeare's certainly not above that. Jumping forward a little bit more, and I've got about 7 minutes left, I'm jumping to Act 4, so I may have to pick some of this up in the next video. The chorus tells us at the beginning of Act 4 on page 66 that now basically is the time of night, right before battle, where the different armies can hear each other. And this is basically the way that it was. You didn't want to attack at night because you can't see each other. You want to attack each other at daybreak. And you're basically at opposite ends of a field of battle, setting up, getting your horses ready, getting your armor ready, getting all of your weapons ready, etc. And then you're going to charge each other at first light. It's really spooky to think that you can sit there and watch your enemies' fires. You can listen to their horses, knowing that as soon as the first light hits, you're going to go over there and try to kill those people. And again, the English are downtrodden. They're sick. They're the underdogs of this story. No big surprise, considering that there's a certain amount of patriotic propaganda, pro-English propaganda to this piece, which again, you hope that Elizabeth would certainly have enjoyed. So the chorus begins. Now entertain conjecture of a time when creeping murmur and the pouring dark fills the wide vessel of the universe. Shakespeare does such a great job of, in the middle of the afternoon of the Globe Theatre, setting up nighttime in warring camps and how still and crazy anxious it is. in the camps. Well, at least in the English camp. Uh, from camp to camp through the foul womb of night, the hum of either army stilly sounds, that the fixed sentinels almost receive the secret whispers of each other's watch. Fire answers fire, and through their paly flames each battle sees the other's umbered face. They can actually see each other. Steed threatens steed in high and boastful neighs. The horses are neighing back and forth at each other, piercing the knight's dull ear. And from the tents the armorers, accomplishing the knights with busy hammers, closing rivets up, give dreadful note of preparation. I don't know if you know this, but knights had to be riveted into their armor. In other words, they had to be kind of sealed in like turtles. If you are an armored knight on an armored horse, you're basically the tank of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and you're very hard to overcome. If you can get one of them off the horse, great. You have an advantage. But if you can't, they're going to run you down. This is known as heavy horse, and it's very dangerous. Again, as I mentioned to you, I think in class, the French had a lot of heavy horse going into the Battle of Agincourt. Less so on the English side, but the English had longbowmen standing way back outside of the battle who could launch their arrows from a long distance and take out a great number of soldiers before they even had to rush each other. Let's see, jumping forward a little bit. We hear that Henry is walking amongst the people, or amongst the soldiers anyway, bidding them good morrow. This is about line 33. Bids them good morrow with a modest smile and calls them brothers, friends, and countrymen. Upon his royal face there is no note how dread an army hath enrounded him, nor doth he dedicate one jot of colour unto the weary and all watched night, but freshly looks, and overbears a taint with cheerful semblance and sweet majesty, that every wretch pining and pale before beholding him, seeing him, plucks comfort from his looks, a largesse universal, like the sun. So Henry's going among his men, calling them brothers and pals. Like I mentioned, everybody's evil and not evil, even and level on the playing field of battle. And he's basically erasing all class distinctions because he wants them to fight. And he wants them to take comfort from his looks of, this is no big deal. I don't care about this knight. It's absolutely fine. You guys are going to do great. The reality of the situation is that in the next scene, Henry's going to, as he says, I and my bosom must debate a while. That's line 31 in Act 4, Scene 1. Line 31 in Act 4, Scene 1. I and my bosom must debate a while. He's not nearly as sure as he seems to be as he's walking amongst his men, giving them, as it says at line 47, back on page 68, a little touch of Harry in the night. I'm giving them, just a little bit of me to bolster their spirits. But Henry dresses up in Act 4, Scene 1. Well, he doesn't dress up. He covers himself with a cloak, so ostensibly nobody knows who he is. And he goes amongst his soldiers so he can actually hear, in disguise, what it is that they really think. This part is not so much to give the soldiers courage, as he was doing in the prologue or in the opening to Act 4. What he's doing now is for himself. I and my bosom must debate a while. He wants to find out if his men will fight bravely for him or if they're going to run. He has to know whether they think his cause is just and honorable and right, or if they think this whole thing is just because they were forced to be there in France fighting alongside him and they don't care at all. They think the king maybe is evil. This is to satisfy his own conscience, his own moral standpoint, his own will. And that's why he's disguised himself, and that's why he's pretending that he's someone else, sounding out what the men actually think about the battle. And as we find out, Henry's absolutely full of concern and, to some degree, fear that his men will bolt, and that he's brought them here on an absolutely pointless and fruitless cause, that God has in some way set him up for a fall because, as I'll talk about next time, Henry V's ancestor, his father actually, Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, did something immoral by participating in the death of Richard II, where this whole tetralogy began. Henry does not want God to take revenge on him for his father's misdeeds, and he's deeply afraid that he will. All of this stuff makes Henry a very multidimensional character, a very human character, a very flawed character, and in that way, we can sympathize maybe a little bit with him in this very, very dangerous moment. All right, I have to stop. More on Friday, and look for those discussion prompts that will be posted Friday morning.